Okay, here we go. Well, hi, Em. How's it going?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing, Rose?
Good. You ready to get started?
I am ready to go. I've been looking forward to this.
Perfect, perfect. Well, thank you all for joining live, and thanks for those who are watching us on recording later. I am super excited to have this conversation with my guest here today, Em Kushvaliev. For everyone else, I met Em a few months ago, and we just hit it off on procurement, life, projects, everything outside of technology as well. I mean, I think we chatted about technology for quite a bit. I had this delicious raspberry cheesecake croissant that you
Yes.
introduced me to. So all right, welcome everyone as we all trickle in. So let's formally get started. I'm Rose Pankunas, founder and CEO of Sudozi. Sudozi is a new intake and procurement intake and orchestration platform, built with a focus on data and AI. And in my past 20 years of finance and procurement experience, I really believe that there is an opportunity, especially now with the technology, to transform the way that we ingest data, we manage processes, and automate the work in procurement. Today, I'm going to I'll let you introduce yourself, and then we'll get going with our agenda.
Excellent. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Rose. I appreciate that. So, just as by way of a little introduction, I've spent really my entire career in procurement, mostly kind of building and implementing procurement functions and programs kind of from the ground up, which has been really exciting. I have done so in both mid to very, very large global organizations. And I've had teams of different sizes, within part of that function, depending on the size of the organization. I've also done a little bit of consulting, which was very fun. And I was able to go in and kind of provide strategic recommendations around what it would take to build from the ground up, which was also kind of a different take on it, which was fun. And the one thing I just wanted to mention that I've really been fortunate to have is that all of my roles have afforded me this opportunity to be what I call a procurement generalist, which means that instead of being in one specific area, like a category expert or overseeing purchasing, for example, I've had this benefit of being able to see all of the elements that go into an entire function, which I love. And of course, keeps me on my toes, but I also find quite interesting. So it's a little bit about me.
Yeah, thanks, Em. So when
Yeah.
we were planning for this, I joked, but not really, that we could go on for like 3 hours, but we have to stick with 30 minutes for now. We have a lot of topics and a lot of ground to cover. We have a couple really interesting and exciting topics about building a procurement function from the ground up. Feel free to use the comment section here on LinkedIn, and we will get to as many questions as possible towards the end. So let's kick things off here. And my first question I have for you is, in your experience, how does the procurement function and organization align with corporate strategy, and why is that important to establish before you roll out any tools or decide on any processes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I think that it's really, really crucial that procurement itself needs to be aligned with the corporate objectives, with leadership. I think that the way in which leadership views, values, measures, and positions procurement has a huge influence and impact on how valuable procurement can be. And I think when you align those two together, you're going to get a lot more value out of procurement. One example that I want to talk about is, traditionally procurement has sat within finance. We're now seeing a lot of that shifting when we talk about sort of modern procurement and kind of ways in which to think about it. I think personally that when procurement sits in finance, there are sort of two things that happen. One is that the focus for the value that procurement brings is on finance and cost savings. It sort of, I think, dims or doesn't shine the light on other areas where procurement can shine. I also have seen that when it sits in finance, a lot of times the different departments and the stakeholders are challenged by engaging with procurement because there's a sense that procurement's sort of like holding the money and they've got to kind of get in. And so they almost will carve procurement out until the end because it's like, we'll deal with the money when we get there. We're just trying to kind of get the thing that we want to buy or do. And so a couple of the things I wanted to talk about here that I think are really important is I think procurement adds so much more value than just cost savings. Obviously, that's a big part of what procurement's here to do. But a couple of other things that I think are really important are developing very strong partnerships with business stakeholders and different department teams. And as I mentioned before, I think when procurement doesn't necessarily sit in finance and is kind of outside of that, that can be a lot easier. But one of the ways in which procurement can add value there is to start to take off a lot of the procurement activities that the business teams are doing, like talking to the vendors, engaging with the vendors, negotiating by themselves, all RFPs, all of those things that I think traditionally they often try to hold on to take control. Procurement can come in right up front and say, you know what, this is where I can actually add value. Let me take the work off that really shouldn't be yours, and I'll ride alongside you and we'll sort of champion this together. So I think that's one area where there's a big value add. Another one that I see is risk mitigation. So there's obviously
Mhm.
financial risk, right? We don't want to pay more than what we should for anything, but there's also legal risk. I think there's business risk. I think there's compliance risk, regulatory risk, sustainability, ESG. I think there's a number of other risks that companies look at where procurement can add quite a bit of value and can tie up with corporate objectives, which I think are important. And then the final one that I think we don't talk about a lot, but I think is really cool is how can procurement overall add competitive advantage to the organization? So
Yes.
thinking
Yeah.
about things like, yes, we want to have cost efficiencies, but how can we think about the vendors we're engaging with, the solutions, the services that we're buying? How can those maybe support our product development? How can those
Mhm.
maybe help us get to market faster and be more responsive or more agile? Or who are we looking at that has really cutting edge technology, and how can we innovate with them by doing betas or getting more involved in connecting with our vendors and sort of what they're doing in terms of R&D? And so those kinds of competitive advantages aren't just about saving money, they're really kind of getting all the way to the bottom line and really sort of adding value to the whole organization. So I think that's why it is so critical to align procurement with those bigger corporate objectives, because I think then you're seeing where procurement can shine way above and beyond just, okay, I can save money.
100%. I think just reacting on that last comment there, last week at ISM World in Orlando, the Chief Procurement Officer of American Airlines saying, look, we have these fueling vendors that help fuel our planes, and every plane that leaves late costs the business X amount, right? With like customer
Mhm.
satisfaction, supply chain, and scheduling work to be done later. And but that's a vendor, right? That's a vendor relationship to be managed, and that's a vendor who is fueling and providing energy to the planes to leave on time and to do all the other operations. And so that's just one example. I think any software, if you're a procurement officer in a software company, this 100%. These technologies or services you're procuring for your engineers are enabling product features and enabling additional revenue. And
Yep.
so to your point, there are I know there are still a number of procurement leaders under CFO and like working
Mhm.
within the CFO's office, and that's, I think, an opportunity to actually educate the CFOs and the leadership on the much more extensive value procurement can bring than the cost savings, which is of course one element of it.
Yeah.
Um,
100%. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
all right. And so now you've established a corporate strategy,
Mhm.
you have your leadership championing procurement as well. Let's move forward on other fundamental elements needed to establish the procurement function from the ground up.
Okay. So this is a great question. And it's funny. So over the last number of years, I have distilled this down to five. Now, five is my favorite and my lucky number. So that all works out really well. I can imagine other procurement professionals might, tweak these a little bit, but I think they all kind of overlap. I will start by saying these are not in any specific order, but what I will say is that if you're going into an organization and you're going to build from the ground up, it's really important to initially kind of assess all of them. You're probably going to find that one or two are going to want to be prioritized over all of them. You may be able to work on a lot of them concurrently. And again, that goes back to aligning with the corporate objective. So is it for the company, oh my God, we really have to save money and that's our most important thing?
Yes.
Or is it we have serious inefficiencies and let's
Yeah.
focus on getting that cleaned up before we dive into the money? So these are the five in no specific
Yeah.
order. So the first one I like to think about is what I call administration. This really is the backbone of the function. This is thinking about how do we get from I need something or I want to renew a contract to okay, we've got it, we've paid for it. And so that is the
Mhm.
workflow that we're using, that is the internal processes, procedures, policies, training, all of that. It also is the collaborative effort with what I call the G&A functions. So finance, legal, IT, business security, procurement, who generally are part of all the checks and balances that go into that workflow. And so making sure that you're thinking about all of those pieces as you build out that sort of what I call the administration of the function. Um, the second item is business partnership. And I cannot stress this enough. If you do not have great business partnership, you are not going to have a successful procurement function. It's going to be very difficult in order to get it.
It'll be
And what I always think about this is sort of, I would argue that establishing business partnerships should be driven by procurement. And I say this because if you wait around for people in marketing or product or facilities to want to build relationships with you or to be consistent in building those relationships with you, you are going to wait a long time, or it's only going to come when it's urgent or risk or like I need it immediately or whatever the issue is.
or the invoice is here.
Yes, exactly, exactly. That's another one. Thank you, Rose. That is a perfect one. So basically, what I try to do when I would go into an organization is immediately set up that sort of ongoing meetings, understand who are the leaders, who are the power users, and really sort of engage and set those meetings up. You want to be thinking too about how are we educating, how are we kind of processing change management with them, how are we communicating. I think those are all important pieces. So that's business partnership. The next one is what I call VRM, or sort of vendor relationship management, or we could call this sort of our vendor ecosystem. This is like everything vendors, sort of contracts, what's going on. And so here is where you're looking at everything from how are we onboarding, how are we engaging, where do all the relationships sit? Are some of them being managed by leaders? Are some of them being managed by just kind of people within departments? Are some of them being managed at the C-suite? And does that make sense, right? But understanding kind of what that looks like. How are we doing RFPs if we are? How are we bidding? How are we negotiating? Kind of all of the stuff that goes into sort of that vendor contract bucket. So I tend to kind of separate that out a little from the admin piece. And then
Mhm.
the final two kind of stick very closely together. So the fourth one is really spend and data analysis. And this is really looking at all the data points, right? So it's everything from your spend, your categories, your vendor information, all of your different contracts, contract types, POs, reporting, all the data. And that's going to then dovetail into the fifth one, which is tools and systems, right? Because all your data is coming out of those tools and systems. So those two play very closely together. But when we think about tools and systems, again, it's looking at things like, what do we have for an ERP system? Is P2P happening in that system, or do we have a separate one? Do we have a contract lifecycle management tool? What's happening with budgeting? Are things integrated? Can we automate things? But I think all of those are really important key things to get your arms around right away when you're really thinking
Yeah,
about building from the ground up.
that makes a ton of sense. Going back to number 2 and 3 on the business partner relationship as well as the
Mhm.
vendor management relationship, what have you seen as a maybe there is no typical starting point. Every company is doing things a little bit differently as you walk in. But if there are any trends you can share or any influences you've tried to make on, let's not have the CEO be the main relationship point of contact or anything like that that you can share in your experience going in and building from that ground up experience.
Yeah, so there have been a couple of times where I've gone in and I've noticed specifically that the C-suite like member of, say, like a marketing team or a product team is engaging directly with the vendor, and not to throw them under the bus, but probably not thinking about certain things that we might want to be thinking about, and or they're sort of in some ways wasting their very precious and important time when they should
Yes.
be working on strategy for their team. And so one of the things that if I see that, I will generally engage directly with them and we'll talk about, how's this going for you? Where can I come in and add some value, or where can my team come in and add some value? Do you need some support? Kind of what are the reasonings behind why you're driving it versus wanting, let's say, a procurement team to do so? And really talking it through. And what I found over and over is a lot of times they'll say, I don't really want to do it, but nobody else did, or we didn't have a
Yeah.
procurement function, so can you come in and help me? The other thing I've also seen happen sometimes is sometimes it makes sense to have a C-suite member do the negotiation because it's such a large deal or it's very complex, and they're engaging with a C-suite member at the
Mhm.
vendor. But it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that procurement can't come in and provide some best practices, some support to kind of help with the preparation piece, so they
Yeah.
aren't kind of all on their own or just kind of going off the cuff, sort of doing things. So
Right.
yeah, those are a couple of examples that I think about when I think back on things I've worked on.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And for someone either just starting to hire procurement and build out that procurement team, I think it'll be important to, understand those relationships internally as well as externally to map that out before starting on any strategic projects, because it needs to be
Absolutely.
aligned, and it'll make things easier if you understand those relationships that are going
Absolutely.
on. Um,
Absolutely. Yep.
so, you've seen procurement at small organizations, large organizations. I'm sure you've seen no problems at all, no challenges, right? um,
I
yeah,
wish.
quite the opposite, maybe.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
as you've gone in, we've just talked about the relationship aspect, and that may not be a challenge, but just understanding what that is. But what are some of the actual challenges you've seen when you've gone in to set up procurement, and how have you tackled those?
Yeah. So, a couple different things. One of my first favorites is sort of vendor overwhelm. So you go in and you're like, oh my
Yeah,
God, I don't know what's happening. We have hundreds of vendors. This is
or thousands.
completely inappropriate. I'm freaking out, that kind of thing. Vendor overwhelm is probably one of the biggest ones. I think that and sort of kind of getting spend under control are
Hmm.
probably
Hmm.
two of the big ones that I see. In terms of the vendor overwhelm, I'll kind of stick to that. I will be honest in that unless you've got a lot of really great tools in place and you can automate incredibly quickly, that process of sort of leveraging your buying power and like whittling down a lot of your vendors is a time consuming one. You've got contracts that are multi-year that you can't necessarily pull kind of vendors off of. You've got different relationships that are kind of all over the organization. So one of the things that I always think about with vendor overwhelm is to draw a line in the sand and say, let's talk about how we are now going to onboard and engage with new
Mm,
vendors
mhm,
so we can
mhm.
stop kind of this, let's throw everything over the fence and get as many vendors in as possible. So that's one tactic that I have used that's really helpful, is really try to kind of stop that and understand where that's going on and really think about what are we doing in terms of risk of negation as we bring in new vendors, both in terms of bringing in, like business security, IT, legal, in terms of looking at that, but also talking with the business stakeholders. Are you aware that you have 322 vendors in your portfolio? And I don't think that that's, like those kinds of
Mhm.
things, having some of those eye-opening discussions.
Yeah.
So that's vendor overwhelm. I think that's a big one that I see a lot, and that's a big challenge. The lack of cost control and saving stuff is really, really difficult. And the best recommendation that I see here is really trying to bring in spend analytics tools, any kind of tools that allow you to see data as accurately and as quickly as possible so that you can make better sort of data driven strategic decisions instead of guessing or not knowing. And so I'm not saying that I've always had that ability to kind of have the budget to bring
Mhm.
in a tool right away. But what I
Mhm.
did do when I had to do it manually was to get an understanding of exactly where the spend was. And then you have that ability to start to drill down and say, okay, it looks like marketing or product or whoever they are spending the bulk of what's going on. Or I see that, the tail spend is like really way over here with this team. What is most important to the company? Where can I really add the most value quickly as we start to kind of whittle things down? But that process does take time just because of the nature of ongoing contracts and kind of a lot of the relationship management there. Um, Another one that I do see a lot is this resistance to change. So this is
Mm,
a
mhm.
really big one, especially if you're coming in and there's never been a function. And what
Yeah.
I found, especially in my last organization, was I would talk to people and they're like, this is overwhelming and my team is doing stuff they shouldn't be and I don't know what's going on, but like we're fine, we can handle it, we know how to negotiate, we don't really need help. So they were like torn between wanting to have control over their vendors, control over the negotiation, control over what they see as choice, and then also complaining about how it was taking a really long time. So in terms of resistance to change, as I mentioned before, always prioritize building those relationships immediately with your business stakeholders. Understand what the pain points are, understand what they need, what they would ideally like to see. If you can show value really quickly, you will cement those relationships. And so, whether
Mhm.
that means saying, hey, listen, I see you're working on something. Would you like some support? Would you like me to come in and engage with the vendor? Let me try to get some better pricing. Let me talk the vendor through exactly how we're going to, walk this through. Let me pull you out of it. I'll keep you apprised of what's going on. They're often very thrilled, like, oh, this is
Mhm.
great. You
Mhm.
came in and sort of
Mhm.
cleaned this up. So I think starting to show that value quickly is great. And I think being really clear about training and communicating, these are what a lot of the benefits are change. I'm going to take a lot of this stuff off of your plate. I'm going to add add value by saving you money. And let's talk about even adding value by maybe streamlining a lot of the vendors that you're working with, so you
Yeah.
have less relationships that you're managing. So that's probably how I've gone in and sort of worked on that change piece, because that can be really, really difficult to chip away at.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
just quickly on this last point, 'cause I know we have 2 other questions, but, yesterday I posted a picture of one of your artistic creations, and I think this is where the creativity and the design and the co-design really comes in, right? Like,
Mhm.
your marketing leader may be in a very different starting point in their willingness to work with procurement than, let's say, your IT leader, right? And, like, knowing for each of them where the 1 or 2 things that they are willing to change and they are willing to partner on, and getting in there and showing the value. I think that's where I've seen both myself and other procurement leaders have the most success. It's not this, here's a script, I'm going to run the script with every department. It's going in and being creative with them on where you can provide value for their teams. And to your point, like showing that value and being able to
Yes,
get that quickly. Yes.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really good point. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. So moving along here, you've built these great relationships, you understand the willingness to change and potentially some of the resistance to change. Now you fortunately have a budget and you can bring on some technology to help you scale, help your team scale. How do you think of technology today? There are so many players out there and so many opportunities.
Yeah.
Should everyone get something and just go for it and experiment? How have you done this? What's worked well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's interesting. Data and technology are so critical right now, and I think they add so much value, and once we can get our arms around them. I think I just wanted to speak a little bit to having tools that automate things, not only make things so much more efficient, but they reduce human error, which is huge, because a lot of the work that goes on in procurement, finance, and so forth is very tedious and sort of repetitive and manual. So I think it's really, really valuable to bring in anything that can automate sort of workflows, automate a lot of the repetitive stuff. The other place that I see that I'm very excited about, and I have to say that I haven't actually had the chance to play with it, although hopefully in my next chapter I will, is this sort of workflow automation, which is incredibly powerful. And I think the workflow automation really runs that administrative backbone of procurement, where you've got everything from intake and kind of engagement with the business stakeholders to being able to engage and collaborate with vendors, whether it's onboarding, risk assessment, negotiations, kind of all the back and forth stuff that has to happen. But also, you've got all of this very quick data. You're able to see stuff in dashboards. You can see exactly how many intakes are coming in, what projects are being worked on, who's approving what, where things kind of sit in queue, which is incredibly powerful. And I think that's where we're seeing procurement go, is really being able to automate it. So I think we see a lot of workflow automation tools. I think some of them are doing some contract lifecycle management pieces. Some have repositories. We see separate CLM or contract lifecycle management repositories that are very
Yeah.
powerful. We often see that overlap with P2P tools and all of the above. So sometimes people have a standalone P2P, a standalone CLM, and a standalone kind of workflow. I think the goal is to try to get to a place where you can automate as much as possible, even if all of that, let's say, is flowing into your
Right.
ERP. So that's kind of what I see. The one thing I will say is, I think it's really important when you're bringing in new technology, is to be really thoughtful about who's involved, who's going to be affected, why you're actually doing it, what success looks like, how are you going to measure that, and that you're very thoughtful about the implementation, about the training, and about the
Mm,
change
mhm,
management. I have seen
mhm.
so many cases, not specifically with procurement software, but we bring in software, people aren't well trained, we don't change manage, we're not using it well, and then it just sort of dies on the vine, and then we've got to rip and replace, and that can be incredibly costly and inefficient.
Yeah. I think there's a huge role technology has to play. I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe in the opportunity for technology.
Yeah.
Everything you said, I was like, plus one, plus one, plus one. And going, fully circle back to the administration, one of the areas that we see really loved in our platform is the ability for business partners to self-serve. Like, oh, where is this? Oh, it's on legal. Let me go connect with my legal colleagues. Oh, it's actually waiting on the supplier for something. Let me help you ping the supplier. And really that visibility and that relationship management. Otherwise, it's like, oh, procurement is taking 5 weeks to do this. No, procurement is not taking, it's like all the work that's being
Mhm.
done in between, and having that visibility leveraging the technology to show that visibility to your colleagues and building those relationships. So
Absolutely.
lots of technology. Keep me posted on what everyone else is using and how you continue to explore this. All right, last few minutes here. There's so much knowledge and so much experience you've gained doing this for several companies here.
Yep.
In 2025, someone on either the CFO is being tasked to hire their procurement team from scratch, or another procurement leader is taking on that first time role again. What are some of the top pieces of advice you give to those teams starting from scratch?
Yep. So I'm going to kind of summarize a lot of what I've said, but I think first and foremost, align with leadership and align with your business stakeholders immediately as you're doing your assessment. You want to identify what the goals, the objectives are, and you want to measure or be able to talk about what successful look like 3 months in, 6 months in, a year in, whatever it is. And that may be slightly different for each group, but I think it's really important to talk about that. Prioritize partnerships with your stakeholders. That is so incredibly important. It will make procurement so much more wildly successful, because it really, at the end of the day, is so much about the people and about the collaboration. So I think that's incredibly important. Um, Establish really strong collaboration with G&A as you're developing your function. So I had that experience at Brightco, that we worked really closely together to talk about what does the workflow look like, and everybody had different say in sort of what was important, how do we want to time approvals, what does this look like, and it made it much more powerful. And then we all worked super closely together across all facets of
Hmm.
procurement, and it was amazing. So that worked really, really well. Invest in tools as early as you can. Anything you can automate, anything that you can make a lot easier for yourself and diminish human error is go. And then I would also kind of finally just say it's really important when you come in, as quickly as you can, start to engage right away with some of your key and strategic vendors. Make sure that you've engaged, introduce yourself, kind of get involved, because especially when there's nothing, they're very used to working with people kind of all over the organization, and it's
Yes,
really important to pull them in and say, all right, we're coming in and we've got a much clearer kind of path forward. So those are
yeah,
probably the top kind of quick insights or thoughts I would share.
amazing. I wish that everyone starting a procurement function could watch this and listen to you. I think they'd be off to a great start.
Thank
I
you.
know this was not scripted, and so I'm curious, talking about the multifaceted nature of procurement professionals. I love for you to share a little bit about Little Wandering Heart and how that came to
Oh,
be, and how the listeners here today and the community can engage with your work.
thank you. That is so sweet. So I started watercolor painting about 2 years ago, really just because it brought me sort of flow. It was very meditative. It brought me a lot of joy, and I just started, continuing to do it. So I was doing it on greeting cards. I started it on little 5x7 cards, and then I just had friends and family. And my mom was a very big proponent, so she got a lot of greeting cards. But people started to reach out and wanted to buy them and wanted to know about them. And so I thought, why don't I just build kind of a website and sort of it'll be my portfolio. So I've been working on that for the last several months, finally just launched it, which is really exciting. So I do sell some of my artwork, but also it's just up there to kind of bring people joy. And so thank you for bringing it up and asking about it. But if people do have any interest in my art, they can absolutely, there's a form on the website under the Let's Connect section. They can check in with me. If they know me offline, they can connect with me on LinkedIn. And I will be doing a couple of local fairs, maybe selling at some local stores and stuff. So yeah, very exciting. My
Awesome.
other gig on the side of corporate.
Yeah. Your other gig. I mean, I think what's been fascinating about this community is, maybe folks are not as skilled, myself included, in this artistic area as you are, but I think what's most exciting about procurement professionals is like most people are doing multiple things, right? It's not
Yes,
just about procurement, purchasing,
yes,
cost savings. It is much more complex than that. And I think the same is true for our relationships internally as well as vendor engagement. And so there are multiple dimensions of any relationship, and using and seeing what is, most powerful or most interesting for
mhm,
individuals can be super engaging and actually help out with the procurement side as well. Go think about art for a little bit and come
yep,
back and bring that to your relationship management or this next negotiation. Um,
yeah.
so super, super exciting. I hope, actually I was having trouble posting on the LinkedIn, but I'll post it as a comment later on as we share this with
Oh,
our
thank
broader
you,
audience.
Rose. I appreciate that.
Of
That's
course.
really kind. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for spending the last 30 minutes with us. I hoped you learned a lot from Em. I know I did. I have a lot of notes on the side here. I I need to formalize and sort of internalize all of Em's comments. So, Em, how can folks find you? Where would it here on LinkedIn? Anywhere other any other social areas you like? LinkedIn's your
I'm on
preference?
LinkedIn. I do have a very active Instagram presence. So if anybody wants to connect with me via LinkedIn,
Awesome.
I love kind of sharing in that. But yeah, LinkedIn's probably the easiest way. So thank you. Yeah,
All right. Well, thank
excellent.
you all for watching. And Em, have a great day. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Rose. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right.
Bye.